This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
And where is the church heading?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Hello, and welcome to the 9th episode of the Naked Mormonism Podcast. We have a lot to talk about when it comes to Joseph Smith getting the plates home after he dug them out of the ground and stashed them in a tree. But before that, there is some business that I gotta take care of real quick. Since episode 8, I've received a substantial handful of new patrons to the show. I didn't think the sales pitch would work as well as it did, but some of you must like what I'm producing enough to secure its perpetuation, and I sincerely thank you for it. There weren't any new NAMO juvenile delinquents, but the Adolescent Rebelhood, which is the second level, saw a bit of a jump in membership. Hal, John P., Marie, and Charlton Simmons. Thank you guys very much for what you're doing to further the show. It means a lot when somebody is willing to give some of their hard-earned money to the show, which isn't a task for the faint of heart, so I really appreciate what you guys are doing. Next in the NAMO family is the new apostates. George G., Doug H., Jim G., and James B. While being an adolescent rebel is good, these 4 individuals decided to take things to the next level. Their kindness and generosity is only surpassed by their amazing level of intellect and wisdom. These 4 gentlemen hold a very special place in the heart of the podcast and help to ensure its continuation with every donation, and I could not be more grateful for that, so thank you guys very much for that. This is all good and well, but all listeners must beware. NAMO Outer Darkness has been opened with the first new NAMO demon, Julie Thomas. Julie has always been a very nice and attractive woman, and while walking down the street, she frequently had to deal with construction workers' shallow whistles or catcalls of approval. There was a construction site 1 block from Julie's job that she had to walk past every single day during her lunch hour. Unfortunately, construction sites aren't free from loud noises and dangers of every conceivable nature, and this day was unfortunately no different. She had been contemplating her existence for quite some time, and had been actively searching for the answers to big questions, like questions of eternity and the meaning of life. So while she was walking past this construction site on her fateful translation day, she had finally realized the truth of her own existence. That there is no afterlife, no eternity for human souls, no punishment for sins, just humans being humans, living and dying on earth. As this painful yet liberating realization surged its way through Julie's mind, she happened to be walking past the dreaded construction site near her job. Just as this thought hit her, a massive crane cable holding a 10-ton steel beam loudly creaks and then breaks with an earth-shattering snap. Julie is standing right in line with where the beam is set to fall, and she has no idea. The loud noises that frequently happen around the construction site were so loud that they drowned out the sound of the cable snapping, and it didn't seem like anything worth paying extra attention to. Workers were aware of the beam falling and were yelling at Julie, "Hey, lady, and watch out!" But having trained herself to ignore their calls, Julie thought nothing more of what the workers were yelling at. She just thought it was a normal day of the usual catcalls. As a steel beam free falls from its near skyscraper height with Julie as the singular target, she notices something glimmering on the ground. With all the noise, yelling, and other confusion that a bustling city street inherently brings about around a construction site, it's a wonder that she can focus on any single thing. but for some reason, she's inexplicably drawn to it. The beam is getting closer and closer, and more people are yelling at her to get out of the way, but any intelligible information is lost in the confusion. Just as the beam reaches Julie, she picks up the glimmering trinket on the ground, and there's nothing but blackness. The beam slams into the ground, shattering the concrete underneath it into dust. Any reasonable person would expect to see a pancaked human being under one small section of the beam, but all that can be seen is powdered concrete and a mangled steel beam. With Julie's new sense of reality and a glimmering Nemo Kingdom talisman in her hand, the surrounding darkness doesn't make any logical sense to her. But as her new eyes begin to adjust to the Nemo outer darkness in which she has just entered, the comprehension of the reality of her situation settles in. Julie is officially the first and most feared Nemo demon in all the Dark Realm. She now holds all the keys to the Nemo Information Kingdom and currently holds the revered Translation Talisman, which is used for any apostate that decides to make the translation into outer darkness. Julie is truly a great demon and will be feared in all the realm as the highest and most notorious demon around. Any Nemo demon that attempts to ascend to the level of Soulbreaker will have to ascend the ranks of all existing demons and carry out a translation to the satisfaction of Demon Julie, as she is the highest ranking demon around. Thank you, Julie, for your support of the show and really for all of your correspondence throughout the genesis of Naked Mormonism. I really will forever appreciate your donations and all of your other support, as they go a long way to making sure that the show continues. If you want a translation story like Julie here, go to patreon.com and search for Naked Mormonism and find out what happens when you become a Nemo demon or a Nemo Soulbreaker. But that's it for the Patreon shoutouts. I did want to address a couple of things concerning the show, though. My monthly costs for the show are hovering around $55 a month. Unfortunately, that doesn't cover the initial setup costs of the show. That being said, the last person I need to thank is Thad Grace. While Thad didn't want to sign up for Patreon, he did make a one-time donation that pretty much covered the startup costs for my cheap-ass rookie equipment that I'm using right now. I seriously cannot thank Thad enough for his generous donation, because now I don't have to include the startup costs into the monthly budget for the show, which means more money will be going to the charities that the show supports even sooner than they would have without Thad's fantastic donation. So thank you, Thad. You have upgraded my diet from strictly ramen to the occasional mac and cheese with cut-up hot dogs in it. You fucking rock. As for the monthly donations, right now the patronage is at $40 per episode, meaning a $25 surplus every month. Half of that will be going to Whitefield's Education Foundation or holding out help, and I'm absolutely blown away. Less than 1 month of active patronage, and the show is already running in the black for me, and I'm able to donate the excess to these resource-hungry nonprofits to help Mormons leaving Mormonism. This makes the show worth so much more than just the mental therapy that it provides for me and the entertainment it provides for you as the listener. I'm at a loss for words as far as how to express how happy this makes me. So I just hope that all the donators know I couldn't keep doing this show without you and all the good that you allow the show to do. So I think that's all I need to address about donations and patronage. All of these Patreon shoutouts will be done at the beginning of each episode with listener feedback at the end after the meat of the episode. So let's jump into the history of the church, which is why everybody's listening to this in the first place. The focus of this episode will be Joe getting the plates home. But leading up to that, there were some forces present in Joe's life that I believe had a bit of an influence on him receiving the plates on September 22nd, 1827. Let's just think about the predicament that Joe had dug himself into leading up to the translation of the Book of Mormon. For a few years now, he had been telling his money-digging friends that he would be digging the plates made from gold out of the Hill Cumorah, a little ways from his house. These guys had been running with Joe and Big Daddy Cheese, who was Joseph Smith Sr., for a long time and had come up dry with every dig they ever performed. But Joe had revelation from an angel saying he would receive these plates by the power of God on a specific day at a specific time. This day and time was well known by his buddies, which were getting more and more anxious every year until 1827 that Joe came up dry with the plates. Most notorious of his fellow diggers were Joseph Knight Sr., Josiah Stowell, who we called Bossman Joe, and Samuel Lawrence, and these guys were in it for the long haul. You see, these guys believed in Joe's grade A bullshit just as much as Joe did, and when it came down to crunch time, these guys got pretty antsy, so that was but one small pressure on Joe's shoulders. He was also a newlywed with a father-in-law that hated him, that's Isaac Hale, of course, and Joe had made the adult decision to get married by eloping with Emma without any sort of means to support the responsibilities that come along with marriage. I would wager to say that one of Joe's heads may have been doing more thinking than the other, because he got himself and Emma into an uncomfortable living situation with the entire Smith family. They were all living under one roof with very scarce resources and an alcoholic head of the household. That's, Big Daddy Cheese, of course. And Joe had stolen the beautiful Emma from her comfy homestead and her father's overprotective gaze in Pennsylvania and brought her to this destitute, rag-clothed family of 11 in New York. He wasn't the provider that society and Isaac Hale had expected of him, so Joe needed a plan. There's also this little bit to throw into the mix. This is from Mormonism Unveiled by Eber D. Howe in 1834 on page 234. It's a letter written by Peter Ingersoll, and that's who provides the narrative, being a first-hand witness. Quote, "In the month of August 1827, I was hired by Joseph Smith Jr. to go to Pennsylvania to move his wife's household furniture up to Manchester, where his wife then was. When we arrived at Mr. Hale's in Harmony, Pennsylvania, from which place he had taken his wife, a scene presented itself truly affecting. His father-in-law, Mr. Hale, addressed Joseph in a flood of tears. Quote, 'You have stolen my daughter and married her. I had much rather have followed her to her grave. You spend your time in digging for money, pretend to see in a stone, and thus try to deceive people.' End quote. Joseph wept and acknowledged he could not see in a stone now, nor never could, and that his former pretensions in that respect were all false. He then promised to give up his old habits of digging for money and looking into stones. Mr. Hale told Joseph if he would move to Pennsylvania and work for a living, he would assist him in getting into business. Joseph acceded to this proposition. I then returned with Joseph and his wife to Manchester." So here we have Joe and Isaac fighting about essentially the kind of person that Joseph was. It's easy to understand that Isaac cared for his daughter and obviously wanted the best for her like most fathers do, so he had some pretty stern words for Joe. Joe utterly collapsed under the pressure of his skeptical father-in-law, and the consequences for Joe's action were coalescing to motivate him to abandon his old ways. Of course, he didn't want to work or get a full-time job like his father-in-law was offering him, but he did have obligations to the lifestyle he was raised in and familiar with. Peter finished that excerpt saying that he returned Joe and Emma to Manchester, New York to continue living in the Smith household, after Joe's little paddling from Isaac. This is presumably because Joe had a bit of unfinished business to conclude with his friends and foes before he moved across a state line to live with the in-laws. During their journey back, they passed the supposed Hill Cumorah. While they were passing it, about to arrive to the Smith home, Joe commented on not being engaged in the work of the Lord enough, meaning he needed to formulate a plan with how things were going to go down and how he would relieve all these building pressures. Peter Ingersoll continues on in the same letter, quote, "Joseph told me on his return that he intended to keep the promise which he made to his father-in-law. But, said he, it will be hard for me, for they will all oppose, as they want me to look in the stone for them to dig money. And in fact, it was as he predicted. They urged him day after day to resume his old practice of looking in the stone. He seemed much perplexed as to the course he should pursue. In this dilemma, he made me his confidant and told me what daily transpired in the family of the Smiths." End quote. You have to admit, Joe had this coming. He'd been running with this gang of money diggers and thieves for years now, and they didn't think anything would change once Joseph got married. They were in for a surprise because Joe was hatching a clever little scheme to leave them all in his wake. Joe was no stranger to doing this all along his journey to profit fame. He just needed to get out of New York at this time, and his father-in-law's house was the best and, well, honestly, the only solution he could find. Joe and Emma were sitting in a transition period. Any day now, they would be packing up and moving to the Hale household, and Joe's buddies were getting belligerent about the story of the plates being up to snuff when the soon-to-come autumnal equinox passed. The transition from summer to fall is a fairly significant time of year and change of seasons to occult practices. Now, I mentioned this before, but I didn't go into any detail, so I'll do that right now. The occult calendar is split into 4 13-week periods. Now, numerology is important when we get into it. 6 is the number of the man, and 7 is the number of divinity. When things are said 3 times, that's the repetition that's necessary to make anything official when we're talking about spells or rituals or anything of that sort. So, when the number 666 is representative, it's the equivalent of implying the ultimate level of flesh and humanity, expelling all other possible divinity. When the number 777 is represented, it implies the ultimate in divinity or holiness. But 777 isn't focused on as much because fear of 666 is much more effective. These numerological conclusions were hijacked by Christianity and applied in a fear-mongering campaign to convert the practicing pagans to early Christianity. The reason I bring this up is to illustrate one small connection to occult practices that Joe had picked up from his father. The completion of each 13-week season on the occult calendar meant 6 plus 7, 6 weeks of the flesh that was whole and complete with 7 weeks of divinity, and a new cycle of life began. Well, the final equinox, known as the autumnal or minor Sabbat, is called Mabon by standard occult practices, and it requires a human sacrifice. That's because it marks the completion of 3 13 weeks in which the spirit and the flesh have been made whole and complete together. So, this may provide some explanatory power for why Joe said that he needed to bring somebody with him in order to get the plates on the autumnal equinox, September 22nd. I don't sincerely think that Joseph planned on sacrificing somebody, because that's completely absurd. He was a much better person than that at this time. But the equinox change meant that it was time to reap what you have sown all year up to this point, as winter will soon be approaching. And autumnal equinox is known to be the most potent of all the equinoxes when it comes to getting your rituals to actually work. Let's continue to suspend reality for just a second and put ourselves there on the night of September 21st, 1827. Joe and Emma had borrowed Joseph Knight Sr.'s horse and carriage from the Smith house that night, sometime after everybody went to sleep, presumably. Not only is the whole family patiently waiting with high expectations of the night Joe was about to have, but they have been waiting for a couple years up to this point, and their monetary survival was almost dependent on Joe coming home with the plates made of pure gold. The Smith family actually planned on charging admission for people to see the plates and making enough money to support the family doing so. But Alvin, the chief breadwinner of the house and the eldest brother, had died unexpectedly 2 years before this, and Big Daddy Cheese wasn't much for manual labor for money or just finding a job in general. Any income brought into the family was by odd jobs that Joe, Hiram, or Sam were doing in between hunting for treasure. The whole family is living in rags and borrowing money never to be repaid from anybody that's willing to have a conversation with them. In addition to these family pressures, Joe's treasure hunting buddy, Joseph Knight Sr., was sleeping at the Smith house that night because he had a financial stake in the Golden Bible being authentic. It all comes down to this night. Can Joe get the plates and the Urim and Thummim in the chest plate just like he said he could for so long now? Unfortunately, We don't know much about what happened that night, as Joe didn't record what was going on. We know that Emma was sitting in the carriage all night praying for Joe to get the plates, and his mother Lucy was back at home doing the same thing, but we will never know what Joe was really doing up on that hill. Joe and Emma make their way back home just after the sun was rising on September 22nd. Before they arrive, there was a bit of a conversation going on about Joe's whereabouts, involving Big Daddy Cheese, Lucy, and Joseph Knight Sr., that we actually have record of. This is taken from multiple sources and synthesized into one interaction the way it most makes sense as taking place. The family was gathering for breakfast, but Joe and Emma were absent at this moment. Of course, Big Daddy Cheese was excited and anxious to find out what happened during the night and attempted to summon Joe to breakfast with the rest of the family. Lucy covered for Joe because she knew he wasn't back yet, but didn't want to divulge her doubts about Joe's success, and thus the outcome of the night to the rest of the family. She quickly told Big Daddy Cheese that she would prefer that Joe take breakfast with his wife. Big Daddy Cheese replied, quote, No, I must have him come down here and eat with me, end quote, in an insistent manner. Lucy replied, quote, Well, now, Mr. Smith, do let him eat with his wife this morning. He almost always takes breakfast with you, unquote. At this point, Big Daddy Cheese consented to his wife's request and began eating breakfast with the rest of the family, absent the newlyweds. Joseph Knight Sr. had decided by this point that he wanted to go home. He presumably considered the night a failure and a waste of time by that point. He goes to look for his horse and can't find it. There are other horses around the pasture, but his is nowhere to be found. He was still unaware of Joe and Emma having temporarily borrowed it without his permission. He comes bursting back into the house and says with a disgruntled look on his face, quote, Why, Mr. Smith, my horse is gone, and I can't find him on the premises, and I wish to start for home in half an hour, end quote. At this point, Lucy interjected, quote, Never mind the horse. Mr. Knight does not know all the nooks and corners of the pasture. I will call William, who was Joe's little brother, and he will bring the horse immediately, unquote. Totally covering because she knew the trouble that was brewing. If Joel stole his money digger buddy's horse and carriage to go get the highly anticipated golden plates and returned empty-handed again this year, Joseph Knight Sr. might do something that expresses just how disappointed in Joe's actions he really was, because Joe was set to move away and Joseph Knight Sr. knew that was going to happen. Joseph Knight Sr. went outside to see if he could find the carriage anywhere, but it was missing as well. He came back inside and announced that it was missing just like his horse was, and drew the accurate conclusion that both it and the horse had been stolen by somebody. I'm willing to bet that he had an idea who stole it, but we'll get to that. Lucy assured him that he had no reason to assume that anybody took his horse and carriage, and that William would be arriving soon with both of them. She recommended that him and Big Daddy Cheese go outside to wait for William to arrive. Both men go outside and talk for a little while, when lo and behold, Joe and Emma come rolling up in the missing property that Joseph Knight Sr. was so concerned about, thus confirming his suspicions of somebody stealing them, even if it was only temporarily. Joseph Knight Sr. and Big Daddy Cheese were understandably amazed to see this occurrence, especially because Joe wasn't carrying golden plates with him, like everybody knew he would be. Joe unhitched the carriage and turned the horse out to graze. He and Emma walked past the conversing gentlemen who were awe and confusion struck without saying a word. The most interesting thing here is Joe wasn't empty-handed. This is probably why Joe was able to walk past Joseph Knight Sr. without saying a word, and Joseph Knight Sr. didn't totally blow up about Joe using his horse and carriage without permission. Joe wasn't carrying a book or golden plates or anything that anybody expected, but he did have a small something wrapped in a handkerchief. Upon entering the house, Lucy could see that Joe wasn't hefting into the house what he had so long promised to attain, and Lucy feared the worst. She became extremely upset and started to shake uncontrollably from her hysteria. She stood up to leave the room so as not to make a scene in front of the family, because she had not forgotten the first failure and didn't want to hear the same story of failure again. Joe stopped her by grabbing her arm, and here we get a small glimpse into the personality of the real Joseph. Quote, "Do not be uneasy, mother. All is right. See here, I have got a key." End quote. This undoubtedly settled her uneasiness momentarily. Lucy continues in her memoir, which is the source most of the situation is reconstructed from, quote, "I knew not what he meant, but took the article of which he spoke into my hands, and upon examination found that it consisted of 2 smooth 3-cornered diamonds set in glass, and the glasses were set in silver bows, which were connected with each other in much the same way as old-fashioned spectacles. He took them again and left me, but said nothing respecting the record." End quote. We don't have any other record of Joe showing that pair of spectacles to anybody else ever. But what we do have is Joe talking to Joseph Knight Sr. after the excitement of the morning had died down, and Joe and Emma had eaten breakfast. Joseph Knight Sr. recounts the tale as such, quote, "After breakfast, Joseph called me into the other room, and he set his foot on the bed and leaned his head on his hand and says, 'Well, I'm disappointed.' 'Well,' said I am sorry.' 'Well,' says he, 'I am greatly disappointed. It is 10 times better than I expected.' Then he went on to tell the length and width and thickness of the plates, and, said he, 'they appear to be gold.' But he seemed to think more of the glasses or the Urim and Thummim than he did of the plates. 'For,' says he, 'I can see anything. They are marvelous. Now they are written in characters and I want them translated.'" End quote. He was, of course, referring to the plates there. Joe was all in at that point, and there was no going back for him. Now, personally, I believe that was because he finally had a working set of plates that could pass a simple weight and textile evaluation, even if they couldn't pass a direct visual examination. Even if Joe didn't have the completed set, he must have been close to finishing it, because he had asked his mom, Lucy, if she knew where he could get a chest with a lock on it. He had to be certain that nobody would be able to take them once he got them home, and he certainly didn't want anybody in the house sneaking any peeks at the plates without Joe's direct supervision and influential commentary. Now, I believe I said in the last episode that Joe asked Mason Chase to make a box for him to contain the plates in. Well, I was mistaken. Mason Chase is Willard Chase's brother, and these guys, along with their third brother, hired Joe and Alvin to help them dig a well, where Joe found his lucky seer stone that he used for his entire life. The man Joe petitioned for assistance in making the box was Willard Chase, not Mason Chase. I'm afraid I have to make that correction. Willard was the town cabinet maker and carpenter, and had done some work for the Smith family in the past, making furniture for Joe's older sister, Sophronia. Lucy sent Joe to Willard, saying that the family would pay for services rendered in the usual way, meaning half food and produce items and half actual money. The history the Smith family has with Willard Chase kind of ends up fucking Joe over. I can try to paraphrase, but Willard Chase says everything so well himself and does a good job of summing up the storyline up to this point. So I'm just going to read from Mormonism Unveiled by E.D. Howe, which contains this letter from Willard Chase himself. Quote, "Testimony of Willard Chase, Manchester, Ontario County, New York, 1833. I became acquainted with the Smith family, known as the authors of the Mormon Bible, in the year 1820. At that time, they were engaged in the money-digging business, which they followed until the latter part of the season of 1827. In the year 1822, I was engaged in digging a well. I employed Alvin and Joseph Smith to assist me, the latter of whom is now known as the Mormon Prophet. After digging about 20 feet below the surface of the earth, we discovered a singularly appearing stone, which excited my curiosity. I brought it to the top of the well, and as we were examining it, Joseph put it into his hat, and then his face into the top of his hat. It has been said by Smith that he brought the stone from the well, but this is false. There was no one in the well but myself. The next morning he came to me and wished to obtain the stone, alleging that he could see in it, but I told him I did not wish to part with it on account of its being a curiosity, but would lend it. After obtaining the stone, he began to publish abroad what wonders he could discover by looking into it, and made so much disturbance among the credulous part of the community that I ordered the stone to be returned to me again. He had it in his possession about 2 years. I believe sometime in 1825, Hiram Smith, brother of Joseph Smith, came to me and wished to borrow the same stone, alleging that they wanted to accomplish some business of importance, which could not very well be done without the aid of the stone. I told him it was of no particular worth to me, but merely wished to keep it as a curiosity, and if he would pledge me his word and honor that I should have it when called for, he might take it, which he did and took the stone. I thought I could rely on his word at this time, as he had made a profession of religion, meaning I assumed that he swore to God that he would give the stone back if Willard ever called for it. But in this I was disappointed, for he disregarded both his word and honor. In the fall of 1826, a friend called upon me and wished to see that stone, about which so much had been said. I told him if he would go with me to the Smiths, a distance of about half a mile, he might see it. But to my surprise, on going to Smith's and asking him for the stone, he said, "You cannot have it." I told him it belonged to me, repeated to him the promise he made me at the time of obtaining the stone, upon which he faced me with a malignant look and said, "I don't care who in the devil it belongs to, you shall not have it." In the month of June 1827, Joseph Smith Sr. related to me the following story, that some years ago a spirit had appeared to Joseph his son in a vision, and informed him that in a certain place there was a record on plates of gold, and that he was the person that must obtain them, and this he must do in the following manner. On the 22nd of September, he must repair to the place where was deposited this manuscript, dressed in black clothes, and riding a black horse with a switch tail, and demand the book in a certain name, and after obtaining it, he must go directly away, and neither lay it down nor look behind him. They accordingly fitted out Joseph with a suit of black clothes, and borrowed a black horse. He repaired to the place of deposit, and demanded the book, which was in a stone box, unsealed, and so near the top of the ground that he could see one end of it, and raising it up, took out the book of gold. But fearing someone might discover where he got it, he laid it down to place back the top stone, as he found it, and turning round to his surprise, there was no book in sight. He again opened the box, and in it saw the book, and attempted to take it out, but was hindered. He saw in the box something like a toad, which soon assumed the appearance of a man and struck him on the side of the head. Not being discouraged at trifles, he again stooped down and strove to take the book, when the spirit struck him again and knocked him 3 or 4 rods, and hurt him prodigiously. After recovering from his fright, he inquired why he could not obtain the plates, to which the spirit made reply, "Because you have not obeyed your orders." He then inquired when he could have them, and was answered thus, "Come 1 year from this day, and bring with you your oldest brother, and you shall have them." The spirit, he said, was the spirit of the prophet who wrote this book, and who was sent to Joseph Smith to make known these things unto him. Oh dear. I'm going to get to the credibility of this letter very soon, but the toad that he talks about there is not just recounted by Willard Chase. There's a few other places that it's recounted, and then the salamander letter that I talked about in, I believe it was the first episode, that was all constructed based off of these references to this toad that transfigured into the appearance of a man and hit Joseph when he tried to take the book. And then he says that the spirit that was a toad that turned into the human being was a spirit who wrote the plates and who appeared to Joseph in 1823. I guess was probably Moroni at the time, but it was earlier recounted that it was Nephi. But we'll get into that too. I'm going to continue on here, quote, "Before the expiration of the year, his older brother died, which the old man said was an accidental providence," with exclamation point. I guess people in that day were pretty surprised at Alvin's death. I wonder what is behind that. I wonder if we can find anything about that. Quote, Joseph went 1 year from that day to demand the book, and the spirit inquired for his brother, and he said that he was dead. The spirit then commanded him to come again in just 1 year and bring a man with him. On asking who might be the man, he was answered that he would know him when he saw him. Joseph believed that one Samuel T. Lawrence was the man alluded to by the spirit, and went with him to a singular-looking hill in Manchester and shewed him where the treasure was. Lawrence asked him if he had ever discovered anything with the plates of gold. He said no. He then asked him to look in his stone to see if there was anything with them. He looked, and said there was nothing, but told him to look again, and see if there was not a large pair of specs with the plates. He looked and soon saw a pair of spectacles, the same with which Joseph says he translated the Book of Mormon. Lawrence told him it would not be prudent to let these plates be seen for about 2 years, as it would make a great disturbance in the neighborhood. Not long after this, Joseph altered his mind and said Lawrence was not the right man, nor had he told him the right place. About this time, he went to Harmony in Pennsylvania and formed an acquaintance with a young lady by the name of Emma Hale, whom he wished to marry in the fall of 1826. He wanted to go to Pennsylvania to be married, but being destitute of means, he now set his wits to work. How he should raise money and get recommendations to procure the fair one of his choice. He went to Lawrence with the following story, as related to me by Lawrence himself. He had discovered in Pennsylvania, on the bank of the Susquehanna River, a very rich mine of silver, and if he would go there with him, he might have a share in the profits. That it was near high water mark, and that they could load it into boats and take it down the river to Philadelphia to market. Lawrence then asked Joseph if he was not deceiving him. No, said he, for I have been there and seen it with mine own eyes. And if you do not find it, so, when we get there, I will bind myself to be your servant for 3 years. By these grave and fair promises, Lawrence was induced to believe something in it and agreed to go with him. Lawrence soon found that Joseph was out of money and had to bear his expenses on the way. When they got to Pennsylvania, Joseph wanted Lawrence to recommend him to Miss Hale, which he did, although he was asked to do it, but could not well get rid of it as he was in his company. Lawrence then wished to see the silver mine, and he and Joseph went to the river and made search, but found nothing. Thus, Lawrence had his trouble for his pains, and returned home lighter than he went, while Joseph had got his expenses borne and a recommendation to his girl. Isn't Joe just a fucking genius? It's amazing. Joseph's next move was to get married. The girl's parents being opposed to the match, as they happened to be from home, he took advantage of the opportunity and went off with her and was married. Now, being still destitute of money, he set his wits to work again. How he should get back to Manchester, his place of residence. He hit upon the following plan, which succeeded very well. He went to an honest old Dutchman by the name of Stowell, and told him that he had discovered on the bank of the Black River, in the village of Watertown, Jefferson County, New York, a cave in which he had found a bar of gold as big as his leg, about 3 or 4 feet long, that he could not get it out alone on account of its being fast at one end. And if he would move him to Manchester, New York, they would go together and take a chisel and mallet and get it, and Stowell could share the prize with him. Stowell moved him. A short time after their arrival at Manchester, Stowell reminded Joseph of his promise, but he calmly replied that he would not go, because his wife was now among strangers and would be very lonesome if he went away. Mr. Stowell was then obliged to return without any gold and with less money than he came. God, he just fucking used... he's amazing. Joseph is so amazing. He used Samuel Lawrence to get to Pennsylvania to court Emma and get a recommendation from a guy to Emma that she should marry him. And after that, he had to get home after marrying her to Manchester, and he swindled a guy by saying that he found a golden bar in a cave that was bigger than his leg. Gold doesn't work that way. Gold ore doesn't work in big bars like that. That's not how you pan or dig or mine gold. That's just not it. But these people just believed him and went with it, and he just took advantage of them. It's so genius. It's brilliant. I'm amazed. So we read all of that just to get to this part here. Well, it was kind of nice to read the history leading up to it from a different person's perspective. But this is the part that was most important to advance the storyline. Quote, in the forepart of September, I believe, 1827, the prophet requested me to make him a chest, informing me that he designed to move back to Pennsylvania, and expecting soon to get his gold book, he wanted a chest to lock it up, giving me to understand at the same time that if I would make the chest, he would give me a share in the book. I told him my business was such that I could not make it, but if he would bring the book to me, I would lock it up for him. He said that would not do, as he was commanded to keep it 2 years without letting it come to the eye of anyone but himself. This commandment, however, he did not keep, for in less than 2 years 12 men said they had seen it. I told him to get it and convince me of its existence, and I would make him a chest. But he said that would not do, as he must have a chest to lock the book in as soon as he took it out of the ground. I saw him a few days after, when he told me that I must make the chest. I told him plainly that I could not, upon which he told me that I could have no share in the book. We were only really concerned with the last 2 paragraphs of that letter. But I did include the beginning of it just because it really ties everything in together and provides a secondary account for lots of things we've talked about in lots of episodes so far. And it's being read from a book published in 1834, quoting a handwritten letter by Willard Chase, who had a first or second-hand account of everything he talked about, and the letter was notarized by Fred K. Smith, Justice of the Peace, Wayne County, New York, on December 11th, 1833. Have I mentioned that I love how accessible and abundant the history of the LDS Church is lately? We can virtually travel through time and see Joseph Smith through the eyes of the people that were there. We don't have to view him with the crushing sense of disconnectedness that so many historical examinations are plagued by, because Joe was exciting enough to write about when people associated with him. Luckily, a lot of these people left behind little gems, just like Willard Chase does here, for us to read and examine nowadays. Willard does such a good job that I'm just going to let him advance the storyline to the next big event, Joe bringing the plates home. Quote, a few weeks after this conversation, he came to my house and related the following story, that on the 22nd of September, he arose early in the morning and took a one-horse wagon of someone that had stayed overnight at their house without leave or license, and, together with his wife, repaired to the hill which contained the book. He left his wife in the wagon by the road, and went alone to the hill, a distance of 30 or 40 rods from the road. He said he then took the book out of the ground and hid it in a treetop, and returned home. He then went to the town of Macedon to work. After about 10 days, it having been suggested that someone had got his book, his wife went after him. He hired a horse and went home in the afternoon, stayed long enough to drink 1 cup of tea, and then went for his book. Found it safe, took off his frock, wrapped it round it, put it under his arm, and run all the way home, a distance of about 2 miles. He said he should think it would weigh 60 pounds and was sure it would weigh 40. On his return home, he said he was attacked by 2 men in the woods and knocked them both down and made his escape, arrived safe and secured his treasure. Joe had to get the plates home somehow. I personally don't think he had his mock set of plates completed by this time. I think he was still working on them. But looking back at the historical record, it would be really, really hard for Joe to have done anything relating to the plates without having a tangible set that met the expectations of people that were interested in the plates. Much like a magician never really shows his or her trick closely or slowly enough to catch or comprehend, everything is done behind a veil of some sort. While most magicians use a top hat with a false bottom or a box that people can lay down in and supposedly get cut in half, Joe had his own set of props. He had a set of plates, these glasses that he made from wire and 2 rocks that he showed to his mom, a box, and a handkerchief, and a whole lot of charm and convincing wit. But I don't think he was ready to bring his set home on September 22nd due to many possible reasons. Maybe he wasn't done with them. Maybe he hadn't even started on them yet. Or perhaps he was afraid of Joseph Knight Sr. and Big Daddy Cheese examining the plates with a skeptical eye, or, God forbid, demanding to see them without any handkerchief covering. Regardless, Joe needed more time, and he made that time by bringing home a concession souvenir, the spectacles, or as he came to call them, the Urim and Thummim, which he supposedly could see anything he wanted with. So after Joe reportedly pulled the plates out of the ground, he supposedly stashed them in a tree or a log somewhere nearby. Then Joe went to a town called Macedon to work for 10 days. Word traveled around that somebody, probably his fellow money diggers, had found and taken possession of Joe's plates that were securely hidden in the woods. As soon as this word spread, Emma told Joe about this, and he hauled ass home, drank a cup of tea, and walked a couple of miles to get the plates from the log to make sure nobody stole them. He grabbed the plates and wrapped them up in his jacket and threw them under his arm and starts walking. So let me take a moment to try and analyze this before we get into the actual account. Let's hear how Joe described the plates and see if we can draw some sort of conclusion here. This was a letter written by Joseph himself as editor of the Times and Seasons newspaper in Nauvoo in 1842. The whole thing is basically the history of the church in a nutshell, but he describes the plates in elaborate detail, and we can construct a mental model of them from the description. Quote, "These records were engraven on plates which had the appearance of gold. Each plate was 6 inches wide and 8 inches long, and not quite so thick as common tin. They were filled with engravings in Egyptian characters, and bound together in a volume as the leaves of a book, with 3 rings running through the whole. The volume was something near 6 inches in thickness, a part of which was sealed. The characters on the unsealed part were small and beautifully engraved. The whole book exhibited many marks of antiquity in its construction and much skill in the art of engraving. With the records was found a curious instrument, which the ancients called Urim and Thummim, which consisted of 2 transparent stones set in the rims of a bow fastened to a breastplate. Through the medium of the Urim and Thummim, I translated the record by the gift and power of God." Now, let's think about this. A solid block of iron by those dimensions, 6 inches by 8 inches by 6 inches thick, would weigh over 80 pounds. Now, the book probably wasn't a solid block of iron, but had some spaces in between the plates. That's understandable, so we can reduce this number by a bit. This makes various people's claims of the plates being between 40 to 60 pounds fairly valid and explicable. A problem we have with this is the difference between gold and iron. Gold is much denser and further down on the table of elements, which is why it's heavier than simple iron. A block of gold with the dimensions that Joe provided would weigh some 230 pounds, and wouldn't be very easy to carry under one arm. But sheet tin and iron were heavily used in those days, and Joe could have found some scraps or purchased or stolen a few bulk-sized sheets and cut a set of plates and ran a wire through some holes that he punched with a nail. This fits the size and weight range he described, but gold would have been so heavy and unmanageable, not to mention the softness of gold would lose the engravings after so much manipulation. That's a conclusion that provides explanatory power for the entire circumstance and doesn't require any intervention of strength reinforcement from a supernatural being for Joe to carry more than his own weight in gold 2 miles home through the wilderness. But for the sake of what the reported history is, let's continue to suspend reality again and say that Joe had these gold plates. They weighed a lot, but by some magic juju, they only weighed a quarter of what they should in the real world. Let's just say that Joe had these 50-pound plates of gold under his arm and began walking home with them. He was attacked by 3 guys in the woods, 2 of which had rifles. The first one was waiting behind a log, and as soon as Joe stepped over it, the attacker sprung out from behind a tree and hit Joe on the back of his head with the butt of the gun. Joe recoiled from this blow and turned to face his attacker. With 50 pounds of sheet metal under his arm, Joe threw a one-armed punch at the man and knocked his ass flat out with his God power-infused mega punch. At that point, Joe began to run at top speed, fearing a similar incident would ensue later on his journey. Well, he was right, and the second man attacked him. We aren't told if this rogue had a gun or not at this point, but Joe threw another one-armed mega punch and knocked this motherfucker out with a single punch too, presumably while still running at top speed with the 50-pound plates under his arm. As Joe was nearing his house closer and closer, a third attacker appeared from behind him. This may have been the first attacker with the same gun, or it may have been the third person entirely. But if it was the first person, he's kind of a dumb shit, because he hits Joe on the back of the head again with the butt of his gun again. Joe, of course, was unfazed by this third attack and turns around and issues his third God-infused mega punch of the night and knocks this guy's ass out too. But this knockout didn't quite go like the others. Joe dislocated his thumb during this particular scuffle, which he ends up asking Big Daddy Cheese to reset once he does get home. Poor Joe. After Joe deals with the third attacker, whether it was the same person as the first attacker or it was a third person altogether, is of little consequence, because Joe continues to run at full speed with the secured plates until he gets home. Once he gets to the Smith property line, he collapses on the lawn outside of his house to regain his breath momentarily. After taking this moment to reflect on what happened and to rest, Joe goes into the house, still understandably out of breath. He had the plates intact and unharmed, wrapped in a jacket under his arm. Lucy directed Don Carlos, who was Joe's youngest brother, to get the wooden box out of his room to put the plates in, which he did accordingly. Now, let's take a look at the effect this story had on the Smith family regarding the plates. Joe had told everybody in the family that there would be people with evil designs to obtain the plates, which was a self-fulfilling prophecy made after he was already persecuted for his actions concerning the plates. Unfortunately, his money-digger friends wanted a piece of the plates as they considered themselves having share in the profit of the plates, because Joe had been telling them that all along. The phrase, "there's no honor among thieves," kind of comes to mind when we examine how Joe uses these people to get things done, and then doesn't uphold his end of the promises that he makes with these people. No matter what was in the jacket that Joe brought home, he and his family were against opposition from multiple people, which somehow validates everything that Joe was doing as being holy and a mission from God. You see, it's easy to dichotomize yourself when you're being opposed by somebody. Most people see themselves as the good guy of their own story, and all oppressors are the evil and unenlightened ones. This is made abundantly apparent throughout history, as it has happened with every religion or cult leader ever. And we all experience that us versus them mentality on a day-to-day basis. No matter how menial the distinction is, that separates a group of people involved. Now, I'm a truck driver, and I fucking hate Prius drivers, because they all seem to drive the same fucking way. Poor snow driving, they slide all over in the snow and have no idea what to do, they hang out in the fast lane and go slower than everybody else, and they take for fucking ever to turn from the main traffic lanes into their destination, forcing everybody to come to a complete stop behind them for no fucking reason. But as soon as that person steps out of the Prius, the distinction is gone, and I can be best friends with that person. I don't care. This is just a small example to show how meaningless these societal distinctions are, and how easy it is to vilify the other guy. But these dichotomies can serve to create a false us versus them mentality that doesn't seem to help anybody and only seems to infuriate the oppressed or persecuted side. Well, the same thing was happening with the Smith family. Whether or not those men in the woods actually existed and actually attacked Joe and actually couldn't overpower him even though he was carrying a heavy package and they had guns, doesn't really matter. because these stories that Joe regaled everybody with and provided broken thumb evidence for united the family together under the almighty Joseph Smith, and whatever Joe said was straight from the mouth of God himself and bared no reasoning for questioning or rebuttal. And thus we see the genesis of a madman cult leader. We have a lot more to cover concerning Joe and the interim period between attaining the plates and getting to the Whitmer house to complete the translation of the plates, and that period of time will be the focus of the next episode. As for now, I have expended my usual time limit, and I haven't even addressed audience correspondence yet, so I'll do that now. As for listener mail, I have been getting quite a bit of correspondence and critiques from people, and I appreciate every one of them. Among various praise for the show and people telling me their stories, which I absolutely love. It's such great motivation for the show. There have been a few critiques that I want to address really quickly. There have been a few people that have said they don't like the nicknames that I'm using for the various heavy hitters in the church, but for every person that has sent me a message about disliking the names, I've received just as many people saying that they like them. So let me just address the issue really quick. When I call Martin Harris Not So Smarty Marty or Oliver Cowdery Cowdung All Over, there are a few reasons behind it. When you're examining the history of the church, it's really easy to divorce yourself from the people that were involved and look at the situation singularly and unrelated to the people that were involved with each situation. While that is a scholarly historical approach and helps to remove bias from a historical analysis, that's not necessarily the scope of this podcast. One thing I've mentioned a few times in the show is how abundant and available the information about the history of the church is. Many people have done a very historically responsible analysis of the church, but what we get to do on this show is stand in the shoes of the people that were there. When you relate to somebody with a nickname as opposed to their formal name, that somebody instantly becomes personified in the mind of the listener. You can construct your own picture of the people we're talking about and relate to them and their actions. So while some of the names might be a little lame or they might not roll off the tongue very well, soon everybody involved will have their own little nickname, and you'll be able to really put yourself into the shoes of everybody and relate to them a little bit better. So I'm keeping the nicknames for the sake of the show and to help listeners empathize with the historical people. But I will occasionally switch back and forth between their formal names and their nicknames multiple times each episode, so they will become familiar in either respect. The next critique I need to address is the fact that I swear occasionally, and I proudly bear the explicit tag. A few people have said that they really don't appreciate the swearing or rants, as it doesn't seem entirely necessary for what's being said. There have been quite a few times that I've gone on rants that were very, very substandard, and I'll make adjustments in light of that fact. However, I don't make any excuses for the fact that I hold a bit of vitriol for the church, and that anger does show through when I'm talking about a topic that gets me riled up or is very near to me. Oftentimes, when I allow myself to get too involved in the rant, my tone of voice escalates in an almost childish manner, and I do apologize for allowing my emotions to invade into the narrative too heavily. And I will be toning it down in future episodes, but the swearing stays. You see, I'm not just doing this podcast because I researched a bunch of interesting information about Mormonism and want other people to have it. I also need the catharsis that comes along with the show. I personally feel lied to for the first 17 years of my life, and it feels so good to call out the organization and the people that orchestrated and perpetuated these lies, and use their own history to do it. If I'm doing a historical analysis and can't add my own thoughts and feelings into it, what is the point of even doing the show? The reason the show is unique is because it's given from an ex-Mormon perspective and has a genuine human nature to it, as opposed to being a simple recitation of facts. And that's why I'm trying to offer so much more than just a dry repetition of what happened without any personality or feeling of being genuine. Hopefully that serves to explain why I rant the way I do, and I hope everybody will bear with me as I practice my delivery methods to be the most poignant and entertaining while still keeping the abrasive yet therapeutic nature of the show intact. Next, I wanted to thank a few people for their correspondence. There have been a few people that have made me aware of information that I knew nothing about, and I really look forward to conveying it in a well-informed manner when the time comes. Hal Prentice told me all about the breakoff factions stemming from the RLDS Church, and a Facebook profile called God's Avatars turned me onto the tracks of the slaughter of a Native American tribe called the Wasaki. Some 400 men, women, and children massacred in one night, among multiple other scuttles between the early Mormons and these Native Americans that resulted in lots of Native American deaths. Miraculously, the members of the tribe that remained alive after this massacre and multiple battles converted to the church and fell under Bloody Brigham's rule. As per usual, when this information comes up in the storyline, I will examine it in depth and give props to the people that were responsible for making me aware of the information. Regardless, I did want to thank everybody that has told me some crazy Mormon shit. I didn't include everything that's been referred to me in this because I can't tell you guys everything crazy right off the bat, but information like this really helps with the shock factor of the show, and I love to find anything like this out along my journey of research. So thank you to everybody that's corresponded so far. I guess that about does it for this episode. Check my Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon page, and I will include links for them in the show notes. There is one last thing that I did want to tell everybody about. I'm going to be a guest on a video podcast called Atheists on Air Beyond the Trailer Park. They'll be doing a Mormon Mania episode with David Michael from the My Book of Mormon podcast, and me to talk everything Mormon. I'm pretty excited for that, and it'll be live January 12th, 9:30 Eastern Standard Time on Google Hangouts and YouTube. So, if you want to see me talking in conversation about crazy Mormon shit, instead of just a diatribe, join us live, or you can download it from iTunes or Spreaker after. Thank you for joining me this episode, and I hope to talk at you again here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. A little bonus content this episode. Thanks for sticking around. It's been a while since I've included a bonus at the end, so I figured I'd share a little more of what Peter Ingersoll said later in this letter that I quoted earlier in the episode. Quote, "One circumstance occurred on the road worthy of notice, and I believe this is the only instance where Joe ever exhibited true Yankee wit. On our journey to Pennsylvania, we could not make the exact change at the toll gate near Ithaca. Joseph told the gate tender that he would hand him the toll on his return, as he was coming back in a few days. On our return, Joe tendered him 25 cents, the toll being 12.5 cents. He did not recognize Smith, so he accordingly gave him back the 12.5 cents. After we passed the gate, I asked him if he did not agree to pay double gatage on our return. No, said he. I agreed to hand it to him, and I did, but he handed it back." So what Joe did there was, as they were passing a toll gate, the toll was 12.5 cents, but they only had 25 cents on them. So Joseph told the toll worker, "Hey, we're just coming back in a couple of days. How about I just give you the 25 cents then, and you don't have to make change for us? How does that sound?" And the toll worker said, "Sure, sounds great. I'll take your word for it, because, we live in a more trustworthy time now than they will live in the 2000s, so why not? Absolutely." So Joseph didn't give him any money, and then on their return, he gave him the 25 cents, and the guy didn't recognize Joe and gave him back 12.5 cents in change, just like he should have done the first time. So Joe cheated him out of an entire toll. Pretty genius. That's not bad. I'm pretty impressed. So Peter continues, "One day he came and greeted me with a joyful countenance. Upon asking the cause of his unusual happiness, he replied in the following language." This is now quoting Joseph. Quote, "As I was passing yesterday across the woods, after a heavy shower of rain, I found in a hollow some beautiful white sand that had been washed up by the water. I took off my frock and tied up several quarts of it, and then went home. On my entering the house, I found the family at the table eating dinner. They were all anxious to know the contents of my frock. At that moment, I happened to think of what I had heard about the history found in Canada called the Golden Bible. So I very gravely told them it was a Golden Bible. To my surprise, they were credulous enough to believe what I said. Accordingly, I told them that I had received a commandment to let no one see it. For, says I, no man can see it with the naked eye and live. However, I offered to take out the book and show it to them, but they refused to see it, and left the room. Now, said Joe, I have got the damned fools fixed, and will carry out the fun. End quote. Now, back to quoting Peter, quote, notwithstanding, he told me that he had no such book, and believed there was never any such book. Yet, he told me that he actually went to Willard Chase to get him to make a chest in which he might deposit his Golden Bible. But, as Chase would not do it, he made a box himself of clapboards and put it into a pillowcase, and allowed people only to lift it and feel of it through the case. End quote. Oh my goodness, isn't that beautiful? That was from Peter Ingersoll, who lived half a block away from the Smith family and was helping Joe move around and was a good family friend, and just told us that the whole thing was a big crock of bullshit and that Joe was lying to everybody about it. It's just amazing. It's all amazing. It's all right here. We can read it. We can look at it. We can see it. I love it. All right. Yeah, thanks for joining me for the little bonus content. See ya.